So this is me. I'm a software architect, API nerd for a good long while. Love fiction. If you want to nerd out on Barbara Kingsolver or something, come find me. I used to work at Wayfair in the cloud native team, a staff engineer there. I forgot to take my mask off. And before that, I was at Every Action. I managed the API there. So today what I want to talk about is the role of trust in a successful API program. And to do that, I wanted to start it off looking at something that's not quite an API, but sort of looks like one. If you're familiar with shopping for food in the US, then you've probably seen one of these. It's a nutrition label. And obviously it's not an API, it's a user interface, it works with humans. But the idea is very similar to what you might see in an API. So it presents this kind of uniform view of the world, this nice, easy to understand data model that we can use to compare and contrast different objects, i.e. items of food in a grocery store. So this spec has been around, the spec for the nutrition label has been around for at least 30 years. It originated with a law passed by Congress in 1992. And follow-on regulations from the Food and Drug Administration. Excuse me. So this spec is, predates OpenAPI by a good 20 years or so. And if you look at this particular nutrition label, you'll, fairly easily find such facts as there's 6 grams of sugar per cup in this, in this cereal. And my question is, how do we know that's really true? Right? As a consumer of this proto API, how do I know that it's really 6 grams of sugar? That's what I'm going to be talking about. So let's jump back into the world of APIs. Let's take a look at what actually goes into an API. So I'll do a simple one here. You could imagine this as an API for like a WordPress blog or something like that. Let's get all the posts for my blog. So I start out with a set of requirements. You need to return list of all published blog posts. I might have pagination requirements in there. I might have cache control requirements for the headers. Have a series of SLOs, SLAs around latency, uptime, mean time to recovery, what have you. Non-functional requirements around security, portability, et cetera, et cetera. So as an API producer, I can take this set of requirements and I can say, great, let's go write some code, PHP, C#, what have you, deliver it onto AWS or GCP, all that great stuff. But after I've done that, I need to go further, right? So if I really want to meet my SLAs, then I'm going to need some monitors. I'm going to want some dashboards that I can get a view of the system. I'm going to want maybe some pager set up so that if something goes bump in the middle of the night, the right person gets woken up to fix it. All kinds of fun stuff. And then I want to produce probably some artifacts for external developers to work with my API. So I'm going to write all kinds of specifications, all kinds of documents. I'm going to write a bunch of tests, and in some cases I'll make the test runs available to my customers. Going to have maybe a status page to show, to prove that things are really up and running. So the point here is, there's code and there's a bunch of artifacts that surround it. And my question is, what is all this stuff doing? My argument is, we're really encoding predictability. So we're creating all these artifacts as a way to say, this API operates in some predictable fashion, right? I've got some documents and I want to show to my customers like this API operates in a way that you'd expect it to. And so all these tests, all these status pages, all these monitors, all that stuff feeds into this general feeling of predictability. Predictability is wonderful, of course, but it's a bit of a proxy, I think, for trust, i.e. a trusting relationship between the producer and the customer, which is great. Obviously, you need predictability. Of course, the world is not predictable. This is just a random sample of events from the last 3 years. I don't think anyone could have predicted them a month or two before they happened, certainly not 6 months. And each one of these had major effects on the APIs that we produce, right? They threw business requirements out the window. They threw SLAs out the window. They threw all this stuff out the window. And so the question is, as a producer of an API living in this unpredictable world, how do I build trust with my customers that I'm going to respond to these events, whether large or smaller, like, oh, my data center caught on fire? How am I going to kind of give my customers the feeling of trust that, like, yes, the API is really going to operate the way that you would expect, even in an unpredictable world? Trust is the key to that, and I want to talk a little bit about like how we can establish trust and specific, organization level measures that we can take over and above writing tests, over and above, really good dashboards to establish trust. So this is my recipe for trust. It only occurred to me after I put this together that the acronym here is CAT. If you're a dog person, I'm sorry, that's the way it is. But it starts with curiosity. So the question is, what is the goal of my counterparty? If I'm a producer, what does my customer want to see happen? What does success look like for my customer? If I'm a customer, the same question in reverse, like, what's going to make my producer successful? And then attitudinally, I want to say, okay, your success is my success. And again, that works in both directions. If I'm a producer and my customers are unsuccessful, I'm not really successful, right? I'm shipping out this great API, no one's using it, or at least no one's using it in an effective manner. And that ultimately is going to mean the death of my API if I don't watch it. Same thing in reverse. If I'm a customer and my producer is operating their API unsuccessfully or unsustainably or something like that, that API is eventually going to die. Maybe the business is going to go bankrupt or something like that. Naturally, that's not something I want. And finally, transparency, right? So if there's hiccups along the way, and there will be, we want to make sure that everything's on the table. So especially this works in the direction from the producer to the customer, to the consumer, right? If I hit snags in my roadmap, if I hit downtime, incidents, contract breaks, I want to communicate all that as thoroughly and as forthrightly as I can. Take contract breaks as an example. You can well imagine a scenario where we have this great API, this blog is up and running, it's doing wonders for its customers, and we realize like this data model is unsustainable, we need to introduce new features that's going to break our contract, right? If I can communicate that out to my customers, give them plenty of warning, let them see that, like, yes, I care about this contract and I want you to be successful even in the face of this contract break, that's going to go over a whole lot better than, oh, by the way, I shipped a breaking change last night, good luck. So transparency is key to establishing that trust. When your customers know that, like, they're going to find out about problems early and often, that's going to build trust. I think transparency is kind of a tricky one. It's much easier to do for an internal API story where we have two teams doing some kind of service-to-service call inside the same data center. You can have a much greater sort of degree of transparency there than when you cross an organizational boundary. But it's an important, even in a scenario where maybe organizations are adversarial or something, you still need transparency. So let's talk a little bit about how that actually operates in the real world. I think a lot of us think about this kind of thing when we think about trust. So what are my person-to-person relationships, or what are maybe my like small group relationships? Two teams going out for lunch together, that kind of thing. That's a great way to build trust, and that's sort of a building block. There's nothing wrong with grabbing coffee or doing a virtual Zoom kind of hangout or something like that. And I think it's like a very underrated feature of organization building. So in a simple, casual venue, we can build a lot of trust. We can sort of satisfy our curiosity about what does my counterparty want. We can have a good deal of, we can kind of build that attitude of shared success. And of course, we can share, we can have transparency around what's coming down the pike, what's likely to sort of get in your way. This, of course, only goes so far. What I've seen happen that can be a really successful and interesting model is more heavyweight. It's like an embed. So the idea here is I have two teams, and one team is going to actually donate some engineering resources or some other resources to the other team to help it accomplish its mission. So this can be, hey, my engineer is going to go sit on your team and work with you to get this problem cracked out, or product manager or manager or something like that. Generally, I think these kinds of engagements work best if you have some kind of contract that spells out, here's what the engagement's going to look like. You're going to get one engineer. It's going to last a quarter. We expect to see, XYZ deliverable come out of it. And so we have very clear upfront feedback or upfront stipulations about what does this project look like. Very critically, item 3, we want continuous feedback between a producer and consumer team. So we want the producer team to get really good, quick turnaround on like, hey, I produced this API, does this work for you? No, it doesn't. Let me fix it. Let me improve it over time. This works really well in an organization, inside an organizational setting where we have, a producer team from the shipping department working with a consumer team from sales department or something like that. That can work great, but I've actually seen this work really well across organizational boundaries as well, where we had, producer team that actually shipped someone over across the organizational boundary for about a month before a really critical deadline. And out of that, we came up with some really good feature ideas that then actually went gangbusters when they went into production at broader scale. This is a very heavyweight thing to do, right? You're actually deleting engineering resources from one area and adding them to another. But the amount of feedback and the amount of context that you get out of it is extremely valuable. So it's not a tactic to be taken lightly. And a sort of happy medium between, you could say, informal relational building and rather heavyweight is this thing I've seen referred to as diffusion of innovation. The concept is fairly old. I think it's about 60 years old. I think we've all seen some variation of this graph. For any new piece of technology, you're going to have some innovators who are just raring to go, who jump into it right away. And you're going to have some early adopters who maybe wait a little bit, and then kind of late adopters. The role of specifically an API producer team here is to really focus on, if I can point here, like this tiny, tiny piece of the graph right here, and to say, I'm going to spend like a crazy amount of time getting the line to go from, here to here, right? I'm going to spend a month on my first innovator or something like that. And the goal there, of course, is not to just burn time. The goal is to make sure that that first innovator, or the first couple innovators, are super duper successful. And the time is well worth it, because the idea is, like, this is how we get context into what the experience is like. And after a month, or however long the engagement is, our ROI on this value that we've delivered is probably not very good, but it is positive. It's not zero. And then if that first piece goes well, then we want to climb up the graph, right? Like, we want to take a look at that early adopter segment and say, okay, can I improve my ROI here, right? Can I spend a little less time on each adopter and get some kind of semi-automated process? And my, ticketing systems, Slack workflows, those kinds of things to help get the ball rolling and help scale out a little bit. And then by the time that we hit this early majority, late majority phase, we have something like self-service, maybe frictionless onboarding, so that, we maybe don't even know all the customers we have. So the point of this this model of like spending a whole lot of time up front is to build that trust, right? This is a forcing function to build trust with your innovators, and in some cases your early adopters as well. So if you've done your homework well, I think there's some real magic that's possible. First and most obvious thing is just customer delight. It took me like 10 seconds to find this tweet on Google. I just typed in like, why is Stripe so awesome or something, and this shows up, and you'll find a bunch of others if you look. I think Stripe does a great job with their API documentation and their overall customer experience. If you can build this kind of trust, you get this kind of customer delight, which is enormously satisfying at just a personal level. It obviously has outsized impacts for adoption of your API and just traffic to your business as a whole. Where I think things get interesting is this thing that I've called the Conway workaround. I have no idea if it has a better name. If you're not familiar with Conway's law, the basic idea is you're going to ship your org chart. It's stated more eloquently by Melvin Conway, but the idea is, okay, you have an organization, maybe a department with 4 teams in it, right? And you're charged with developing some product. Canonical example is like a compiler. Okay, our department is going to produce a compiler. There's 4 teams. We're all going to work together. Conway's law says you're going to produce a 4-pass compiler out of this thing. And so then the problem is, well, what if I really need a 3-pass compiler or something like that? What you can do is there's a kind of clever trick called the inverse Conway maneuver. You say, actually, as a manager of this department, I know I'm going to want a 3-pass compiler, so I'm going to reorganize my department to create 3 teams. And now I'm going to throw the problem at them, and Conway's law says I'm going to get a 3-pass compiler. Isn't that great? This is all very clever. The problem is, of course, you sometimes don't know the structure of your solution, pre-hoc, as it were. You don't know what structure of solution you want. And so pulling an inverse Conway maneuver is just not that easy. So my view is, if you have sufficient trust, especially inside an organizational boundary, you can do this funny thing where, sure, you figure out your requirements, you probably have to hack for a while to get a product together, and then what you can do is you can actually move that product around inside your organization to get the org chart and the product shape to combine in the way that you want. So you can say, well, this team has been working on this piece of the product over here, and this other team has been working on this piece of the product over there. I'm actually going to just change the responsibility so that this third team owns both of them. That kind of thing in the general case is very difficult to do. It takes, you tend to run into a lot of territoriality, hurt feelings, this, that, and the other thing. I think if you have sufficient trust established early on, then you can do that much more easily and much less friction-y. And so you can have this happy situation where you walk into a product development not knowing exactly what it is that you want, but you can still sort of shape the product and the organization together in a way that's successful. And then the final thing that I think is really exciting about trust is that you can get this sort of novel reuse effect. So I don't know about you, but from time to time I've had these experiences where I'll develop an API and some little feature in the API turns out to be super duper useful in a way that I never even expected, right? And 3 months later I find out that customers are using it in some like really interesting way, and they're making like entirely new use cases possible in a way that I never anticipated. That I think is like really the magic of APIs. That's like really what I think makes this work so exciting. And I think that this possibility is a lot more likely to happen if you have a good foundation of trust, right? A good foundation of trust means that you understand your customers. You understand your customers much better. You're much more likely to build affordances into your APIs that enable this kind of reuse. And on the flip side, when you see your customers start to do this kind of thing, if you have a good foundation of trust, you're much less likely to freak out and shut it down, and you're much more likely to say, that's so awesome, how can I help you? So this, I think, is really kind of the magic of APIs. And I think trust makes this kind of thing much more possible. So we'll return to this question about 6 grams of sugar, right? So I said earlier, this box of cereal apparently has 6 grams of sugar per cup. How do I know that's actually true? I looked up public trust in the FDA, which is, if you're not aware, the Food and Drug Administration is the U.S. agency that regulates labels on our food, right? This is a report from NPR in May of 2021. Somebody did a poll. The FDA, you can see down second to last line there. If you add up those numbers, 75% of the public trust the FDA, right? The NPR report in question, the context here, this is like shortly after the worst of coronavirus was over in the US. The context here was like, oh my gosh, trust in the FDA is so low. This is such a crisis. And you know, trust in the FDA had fallen. This is actually a serious issue, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to point out 75% of the public trusts the FDA, and that's considered like a crisis. This is kind of, I think, a picture of like really success of an agency, success of an organization that has like that degree of trust. Hopefully these numbers will bounce up even higher, right? But my answer to that question, like how do I know it's actually 6 grams, is I trust the FDA, right? I know that there's a law that they're responsible for enforcing. Companies are subject to it, and you know, there's consequences if they don't follow it. So fundamentally, I think this chart is why we trust those food labels, right? And coming back to the world of APIs, you know, your customers are going to trust the output of your API to the degree that they trust you, and that they're going to know that when weird things happen, whether they're coronavirus or just a data center failure, they can trust your API to the degree that they can trust, you know, your producer team. That's my basic pitch. Happy to answer any questions, thoughts, etc. You're also welcome to contact me offline if you're so inclined. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely.
If you could pick one thing to convey trust, what would you focus on?
If I could pick one.
Portal, contract, documentation.
So in other words, if someone said, you know, this API has to go out tomorrow, you can do one thing to generate trust with your customers, what is that thing going to be? Right. I think high quality documents is what I would choose. Like if I could only do one thing. Otherwise, you know, my customers really have no idea what the heck I'm, you know, purporting to do in the first place. They can't trust you if they don't even know what it is that you're, you know, claiming to do. And I would certainly, you know, some kind of badge around like test runs and status page would like follow very closely there if I got to cheat. Yeah.
In that same context, would document alone is good for an API playground or an API sandbox where they can actually get an experience with development? Would that increase?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right, documents are just kind of a starting point, right? If you have some kind of sandbox or maybe like an SDK that makes the friction of the consumption experience as low as possible, so, you know, generically, like customers can start playing with it right away and start seeing value, even if it's just a single API call in a matter of seconds, like absolutely, that's extremely important. I don't know if this is the right name for it, but I've called it like time to hello world. In other words, once a customer decides they want to use my API, how long does it take that customer to initiate their first successful API request? Obviously, I want to drive that number down to as close to 0 as possible. And that's something, obviously, you know, you can measure, you can develop KRs around, et cetera, and so forth. Cool. Any other thoughts, questions? Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And I'll be out in the lobby afterwards if anyone wants to chat.